Honors 10, we're going to begin our flipped classroom again, and this time we're talking about clauses. Today our goal is to first look at conjunctions and then to try to tell the differences between the two different types of clauses. So before we begin, we need to review our conjunctions. If you'll remember, there's actually three different types, but two that matter when clauses come into play. The first is a coordinating conjunction. This is what we used to call fanboys. Fanboys is an acronym for all the conjunctions: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Those conjunctions are used to join two independent clauses. The other type of conjunction is called a subordinating conjunction. That's the kind of conjunction that will matter to you in this unit. There's a list that I'm going to show you. Please write it down. The only way for you to learn your conjunctions, your subordinating conjunctions, is to memorize them. Take a look at the list. These different types of conjunctions, we have two different types of clauses. The first is an independent clause. Independent clauses are basically short, simple sentences. Parts of a sentence that has its own subject, its own verb, and does express a complete thought. So it can stand on its own and be an independent sentence, a complete sentence. Whereas a subordinate clause, think about the word subordinate. Subordinate means beneath or dependent upon. And so a subordinate clause is one that has its own verb and subject, but cannot stand alone. It depends on another sentence to form a complete meaning. So these subordinate clauses usually include a subordinating conjunction. They'll begin with a subordinating conjunction, a subject, and a verb. Sometimes, however, the conjunction and the subject of the clause will be the same word. That's called a relative pronoun. Those are going to be words like who, or which, or that. So let me give you a few examples of subordinating clauses, or subordinate clauses. A subordinate clause might be, because I like to read. Because is your subordinate conjunction. I is your subject, like is the verb, but it's not a complete thought. That's not a complete sentence. So it is dependent on the rest of what I have to say to express a complete thought. Now, today we're also going to cover adjective clauses. Adjective clauses are subordinate clauses that act as adjectives. So they do what adjectives do. They modify nouns. They tell us which one, how many, how much, or what kind. Let's take a look at some examples of both of these things.
All right, so when we take a look at independent versus subordinate clauses, we need to look at the underlined portion. Because the amount of sunlight changes. That's not a complete sentence, so I know it's subordinate. Because is my subordinating conjunction, amount is my subject, and changes is my verb. For number 2, it looks larger. That is a complete sentence, so this one is independent. For 3, he forgot to comb his hair. Again, that's a complete sentence all by itself, so that one is independent. Number 4, who recently moved to New York. That's not a complete sentence. Who is my subordinate conjunction, but it's also a relative pronoun, so it is also the subject of the subordinate clause, and moved is the verb. So anytime you have a word like who, or that, or which, relative pronouns, those can be conjunctions and subjects creating the clause. Lastly, he was tired. That is an independent clause. Looking at adjective clauses, I first need to find the clause. In sentence 1, my subordinate conjunction is who. My entire clause is who was born in the United States. And this is a clause that's describing T.S. Eliot. My subordinate conjunction and my subject is who, and was is my verb. In the second one, that is my subordinate conjunction. That it will run is my entire clause. It's describing the course. My subordinate conjunction is that, my subject is it, and will run is my verb. In 3, which is my subordinate conjunction. My entire clause is which are an endangered species. That's describing the gorillas. Which is also my subject as a relative pronoun, and are is my verb. In the last example, who will mail it tomorrow is my clause. Who is both my conjunction and my subject. It's a relative pronoun. Will mail is my verb. And this clause is describing Edward's father. Now, if you'd like, you can take the remainder of the video as practice for yourself. I'll show you a few sentences. I'd like you to pause it, practice, and then I'll go over the answers. So if you'd like to, right now, pause the video and try to identify the clause as subordinate or independent and see if you can find the subject and verb. Let's see how you did. Whom you met is subordinate. Your subordinate conjunction was whom, your subject was you, and your verb was met. For number 2, until they are 8 years old is also subordinate. Until is your conjunction, they is the verb, they is the subject, and are is the verb. In number 3, I praised her to the store manager is independent. I is the subject, praised is the verb. In the next one, before the snow began is subordinate. Your conjunction is before, snow is your subject, began is your verb. And lastly, he began to study art is independent. He is your subject, began as your verb. Here's a little practice for you for adjectives. See if you can just find the clause and tell me what it modifies. All right, in number 1, where every president has lived since 1800 is the adjective clause describing the White House. In number 2, who first lived there is describing president. Number 3, that you heard is describing music. And for number 4, that has never been authenticated is describing one.